Welcome back, boys and ghouls. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, please like, share, comment, and Hulk smash that subscribe button. But now, it is trivia time. This is a sort of what-if episode where we'll be examining an issue that very nearly transpired but never actually happened. I definitely don't plan on doing a lot of these episodes, as usually when these issues don't happen, it's for a very good but very mundane and boring reason. Plus, who really cares? Why spend the time learning about something that never really happened? If, however, the story about why it never happened is more interesting than the actual issue in question ever could have been, well then you can sign me up and you can expect a video about it. This is the case for one of the most intriguing would-be stories in comics history, Mike Allred's original Sandman issue, an issue that would have preceded his contribution to Sandman 54 by almost 25 issues, but alas, was not to be. The Titanic tale involves legendary Sandman scribe Neil Gaiman, orchestrator of the British invasion, and the woman responsible for hiring Gaiman to work on Sandman in the first place herself, editor extraordinaire Karen Berger, as well as a bevy of other longtime jobbers and industry stalwarts. Gaze with me now through the eyes of Uatu into a world that might have been. A world much like our own, in fact. This, though, is a world where Mike Allred was recognized as a visionary talent and rewarded an issue of one of the most coveted titles in comics history early on in his career, perhaps too early. For it is also a world that may be in peril of having never known the true genius and potential of comics' ultimate madman, the inimitable Michael Dalton Allred. The art duties on Sandman have over time mostly become associated with Dave McKean, who provided covers for the original entire series, as there was what seemed to be an almost never-ending list of revolving artists on the title beginning with issue 12. The insanely talented Sam Keith was ready to go after issue 3, claiming he was completely wrong for the series before even finishing his work on the first issue, and only stuck around until they could find a replacement for him most of the way through issue 5. Malcolm Jones III then bowed out of responsibilities before even completing a full issue as well, instead opting to ink issues 6 through 12. The most iconic interior artwork was probably contributed by Mike Drengenberg. Drengenberg only did the pencils for issues 6 through 11, but a lot of what Sam Keith had initially designed for the series was heavily altered and refined into a template that could be replicated for the rest of the series by Drengenberg. Ultimately, however, death is what would tie his name to this series for all time, with Drengenberg providing the design and the first interior art for the most beloved of the endless, thereby endearing his art to millions and millions of people. While Mike Drengenberg might have solidified how the Sandman characters and their universe would look, he definitely wasn't interested in sticking around on the title full time. After Mike Drengenberg resigned as the full-time artist with issue 11, there were some immensely talented artists that provided art for either single issues or sometimes a single story inside of a particular issue. Of the numerous celebrated artists that worked on Sandman after Sam Keith, Mike Drengenberg, and Malcolm Jones III departed the title, few are as fondly remembered as Mike Allred, especially for a single story. One of the geniuses of Sandman was its ability to tell standalone stories that didn't require any previous knowledge of continuity, or in a lot of cases, the characters for that matter. Part of the world's end story arc, the Golden Boy is often brought up as essential reading, even if you don't pick up another issue of Sandman in your entire life. Allred's work on the Golden Boy is undeniably magical to look at. There's usually already a whimsical, ethereal aesthetic to Allred's work anyways, and despite the somewhat dark tones of the story elements, the Golden Boy is even more gleaming and upbeat than usual. Turns out there's a reason for that. I also find it worth mentioning that the Golden Boy isn't just a single issue, it's a single story inside of a single issue. Also, the titular Sandman himself, Morpheus, only makes a tiny cameo along with a 2-page appearance by Death. The point is, the Golden Boy isn't about them. Golden Boy is about two old Joe Simon characters, one that goes by the name Prez and the other a sinister being known only as Mr. Smiley. I don't want to talk about it too much here. If you'd like to see an Off the Beaten Rack episode about it, get in the comments section below and we can go into more detail about it there. If you've read it, then you know what I'm talking about though. It's one of the best single issues of a comic series I've ever read, and on a very short list of contemporary comics, especially from the 1990s, that would make my list of the best comics of all time. And yes, it is that good. Golden Boy doesn't just look amazing, the story really sets it apart from the pack too. The theological implications of the story alone are enough to keep you dizzy for days dissecting every angle and idea that's presented. Gaiman is most certainly at the top of his writing game here, even putting much of his other Sandman work to absolute shame with this issue. But while the writing may be masterful, Allred is who sells the idea here. The artwork firmly planting the reader's feet in a parallel Earth, one very much like ours but slightly skewed, a cartoonish reflection of sorts. The Golden Boy is one of my favorite comics of all time, and I'd always wished that Mike Allred had done more work for Sandman, as I think his art style is really well suited to the look and the feel of Morpheus especially. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Morpheus and Death only show up as minor cameo characters in the Golden Boy, and we never really get a chance to see Mike Allred's capabilities pushed to the limit with either character. Oftentimes when I get to thinking about stuff like this, I know I can't be alone, and thanks to Google, you can find a glimpse of just about anything if you look hard enough. I figured there had to be at least commissions or sketches that Allred had done of the Sandman universe for other fans of his work that I hadn't seen, so like usual at 4 a.m. instead of going to bed, I started furiously researching the subject on the internet. Almost immediately, I found a wonderful pinup page that Allred had done of Morpheus, at least that's what it appeared to be. It was a great blown up headshot with a smaller body detail on the left-hand side. It was everything I had imagined Allred would do with the character, and I clicked on the link and was checking out the illustration more closely, assuming it was a commission or a rejected pinup page for some project, when I noticed the text notation at the bottom. This wasn't a commission, and it wasn't done for the Golden Boy story or any other part of Sandman issue 54 either. It was a sample page that Mike Allred had done when he was trying out for the Sandman title over 30 issues and 3 years earlier. This story is crazy, and to be clear, it varies just a little bit depending on who's telling it. There's probably a good reason for that, which will become very evident as we get into the story, but here's what they can agree upon. Neil Gaiman and Mike Allred both say that Allred was sent a copy of the story Facade, which would ultimately be published in issue 20 of Sandman right around the publication of issue 17 in July of 1990. Like a lot of other people, Mike Allred had seen the Rolling Stone Sandman advertisement, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, let me take 2 seconds to explain this phenomenon to the uninitiated. I know that in 2020 this sounds funny and maybe even a little bit insane, but I don't think that you can overstate the importance of that Rolling Stone ad. If you were around when Rob Liefeld and Spike Lee released that terrible Levi's 501 jeans commercial, you might have some idea of the amount of hype this created in a time when there was no such thing as hype about comic books. Unlike the Levi's commercial, which is unfortunately tied to the speculators crash in the market during the 1990s and kind of leaves a really bitter taste in your mouth at this juncture, the Sandman Rolling Stone advertisement was also historically important. It in fact played a crucial role in keeping Marvel and DC from going bankrupt after the boom was over with the speculator market invasion during the 90s. And as always, if you want to hear the full story behind the Sandman Rolling Stone ad, get in that comment section and sound off. The point is, after the Rolling Stone ad, not only was the industry ablaze with talk of Neil Gaiman and his runaway success on the Sandman title, but now Sandman had become the first comic book in history to have a full color page advertisement in Rolling Stone magazine. And again, this was back when that was actually a thing that mattered and people actually read. With an already revolving cast of artists involved with the series anyways, after the Rolling Stone ad, artists were knocking down the door for a chance to work with Neil Gaiman on Sandman. Life was good for Neil Gaiman, and sales weren't going anywhere but up for him. He had his choice of gigs and was even getting so many offers for work, he was starting to turn down stuff. Mike Allred's career at this point, on the other hand, was a completely different story. Spurred on by the success of Eastman and Laird with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the ensuing black and white comic boom, Mike Allred had decided to take the plunge and create his own comic books. He'd even managed to successfully pitch and sell a series to Renegade Comics, one of the innumerable independent publishers that had risen due to the black and white explosion after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Renegade gave Mike Allred the green light on the project, as Allred was struggling to make ends meet and was actually in the process of moving overseas for a job as a radio broadcaster, which was what was paying the bills at that point. Despite this fact, Allred tirelessly worked on the series during this moving preparation. Just prior to leaving, and about 100 pages into the project, however, Mike Allred received a letter from the publisher Denny Lubert saying that Renegade just couldn't make ends meet anymore and she was calling it quits. His project was dead in the water and he had no backup plan. While he was overseas, Allred actually met Neil Gaiman just after the release of Sandman issue number 1 at a book signing, with Allred already being an enormous fan of Neil Gaiman's work on Black Orchid, which he got signed. Allred and Gaiman talked a little bit, and before leaving, Allred prophetically told Neil Gaiman that they would work together someday. Gaiman half-jokingly agreed, and they went about their merry ways, thinking nothing more of it. It was around this time that Jaguar Stories happened, or I guess around this time that Jaguar Stories didn't happen. See, Allred was done with Europe by this point. He was finished with being a radio broadcaster, and he really wanted to make a go at comic books. But he didn't have any money to move back home or a job to support him or his wife with if they did manage to get back to the States. Then a man named Steven Siegel called up Mike Allred with an offer that changed his life. Most people these days have no idea who Comico was unless they happen to be diehard Matt Wagner Grindel fans. In the 80s, though, honestly, that wasn't much different. I personally think that Comico released some absolutely amazing stuff. Mage is incredible. They published some Dave Stevens Rocketeer work, and anybody who released a Sam and Max comic is golden with me. But Comico never got a name, and by and large, a lot of their stuff was really second-rate and cheesy. Inside the industry, while they didn't have big characters to lure in talent with or any notable titles, they instead instituted a very decent page rate for their artists, despite hiring up-and-coming talent as opposed to established names. Steven Siegel offered Allred 12 monthly issues at a very livable wage, a full year's employment with him through Comico Comics on a proposed title, Jaguar Stories. Then Comico filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy halfway through production. Not only was Mike Allred's comic once again not getting published, once he'd already moved back to the US banking on the incoming money from the ongoing Jaguar Stories, Allred had no idea how he was going to pay the bills again. Out of a job and running low on funds and ideas, Allred resorted to selling ideas based on his own rough work that he'd been scribbling in between failed projects, first as the black and white work Graphique Musique to slave labor graphics, and then to Caliber, who presented his work in color featuring an alternate spelling of the title, now Graphic Music. The black and white boom was over, and while Marvel might have gone on to record-breaking sales with several titles not long after this, they would also file for bankruptcy themselves before the end of the decade. Despite fans beginning to react to Caliber's graphic music, things were bleak, and Mike Allred was beginning to lose hope he would ever make it as a professional cartoonist. It was then that he got a call from Neil Gaiman. The Neil Gaiman that Allred had met as a fan only a few short years earlier and proudly proclaimed that he was going to work with someday. It was kismet, karma, fate. Call it what you will. Mike Allred knew this was the call he'd been waiting for. Apparently, Matt Wagner, who Mike Allred had worked with at Comico, had shown Neil Gaiman Allred's work and suggested him for the series. When Neil Gaiman saw Allred's work, he recalled their meeting and immediately asked for contact information so he could get a hold of the artist. Things were finally starting to look up, and it seemed like there might finally be light at the end of the tunnel for Mike Allred. Unfortunately, that's not quite how things played out. When Mike Allred talked to Neil Gaiman, and I'm going to say that Mike Allred thinks he remembers this conversation very well from the way he describes it so consistently. The only thing Mike Allred heard Neil Gaiman say was, quote, "I love your stuff, and I want you to work on Sandman. I'm going to send you a script. Can you bang out some sample pages for me?" And he's not remembering things incorrectly here either. Neil Gaiman wanted Allred to work on the series. Quote, "I loved his stuff. I would have said yes in a shot." End quote. So this was in essence what Gaiman had said. Unfortunately, the exact meaning of these words was somewhat lost in translation. Neil Gaiman didn't have near the authority required to actually offer Mike Allred any kind of job himself. What Neil Gaiman meant was that he would provide Allred with a tryout script, and that pending approval of the sample pages by editor wonderkid Karen Berger, he would then officially be offered a job by Vertigo. Even more unfortunate was the fact that Mike Allred was oblivious to this until he actually spoke to Karen Berger, who is famous or infamous, and you can take your pick here, for being extremely frank and outspoken. Still, with Neil Gaiman vying for him to work on the series, and given Gaiman's rising star status at that moment, Allred saw little standing in between him and his dream of working with Gaiman on the Sandman series. Karen Berger wasn't nearly as sure as Allred was, though. She didn't seem very impressed to begin with, and plainly explained what they expected from him before they even considered actually giving him a job. Allred was told to complete 4 sample pages from the provided Facade sample script over the weekend and send them back to the DC offices for review, and that they would get a hold of him. While slightly taken aback by Berger and her cavalier attitude, Allred was not to be deterred and enthusiastically set to work on his assignment. Again, showcasing the amazing work ethic that has helped Allred become as indispensable in the industry as he has. Allred did 5 pages instead of 4, and a painting just to go the extra mile and impress her. He smugly sent the package off to DC and sat back waiting for the phone to ring. Monday came and went, and then Tuesday and Wednesday. A week went by, and Mike Allred decided to call up DC that Friday to make sure they'd gotten everything okay. Neil Gaiman himself wanted him on the series after all. What could the hang-up be? Karen Berger would be that hang-up. Karen Berger explained that they had indeed received the submission and apparently proceeded to tell Mike Allred in no uncertain, polite, or kind words that he, quote, wasn't ready yet. Mike Allred was devastated. It seemed like every time he was poised to make a big move, not only did the rug get yanked out from under him, but things just kept getting worse. First the Renegade book, then Jaguar stories. Now Neil Gaiman himself wanted to hire him to draw an issue of one of his favorite comic books. A comic book that was gaining international notoriety and expanding what people thought that the comic book medium could be capable of, and some editor was telling him he wasn't ready. The world somehow seemed to be conspiring against him, and Mike Allred was crestfallen. With his back against a wall and his Jaguar Stories money completely gone at this point, he again began to think he might not actually make it as a comic book artist. Allred was so depressed and convinced at this point that he'd blown or been denied his only real chance at making it in the comic industry for the last time. He was going to have to give up and get a real job. It was around this time he stopped being so depressed and started getting angry about the whole thing, though. Most lesser men would have tossed in the towel at this point. Mike Allred tossed most of the original art for the failed Jaguar Stories into a fire instead. Literally. He destroyed not only nearly all of the original art for Jaguar Stories, but nearly everything he created during this period in general. The rejection on Sandman could have been the straw that finally broke the camel's back. Mike Allred could have just called it quits then and there and gotten a job in the journalism or the broadcasting field to support himself and his loyal wife Laura. Mike Allred isn't that kind of guy, though. Mike Allred went from being depressed, sad, and subdued to pissed off and ready to do something about it really quick. Allred has never been the kind of guy to stay down, no matter how hard you hit him, and he quickly started searching for a solution to his problems. The answer would come from an unlikely place. His work, begun in graphique musique for slave labor graphics and continued in graphic music for Caliber, had given birth to a character that he then used in a subsequent publication, Creatures of the Id, as well. Subconsciously almost, it seems, Allred had been slowly distilling and refining the concept and design of this bizarre character he'd introduced since its inception several years before. As more and more people took note and interest in this independent work from Allred, for the first time in his career, he began receiving a sizable amount of positive feedback from fans and colleagues. He finally had some momentum, and Mike Allred knew he had to keep it up. Allred decided to, quote, dig in his heels and really get committed at this point, working to refine his art, writing, and visual storytelling abilities, as well as working to perfect his own character, which was getting more and more attention with every publication he appeared in. Decades later, the two might be friends, but at that moment, right then and there, at the end of 1990, Karen Berger was the face on the punching bag for Mike Allred, a reason to get up in the morning and keep fighting. She was the Spider-Man to his Venom. Every copy of a comic he sold was a slap in her face, and that was all fine and well, but Mike Allred wasn't interested in smacking Karen Berger around. He wanted to take her head off. There would never be another snobbish, pencil-pushing editor who would ever tell him that he wasn't good enough. Again, he was done hearing the word no. As I mentioned, Allred was getting particularly good feedback and had inexplicably found himself drawn to refine and perfect one of his characters across multiple titles and works by this time. Part Frank Sinatra, part Albert Einstein, Allred's creation was 100% Madman. Even his name is iconic and unforgettable. Madman would go on to become a stalwart member, as well as one of the only long-lasting independent characters that broke out in the 1990s. The publishing history is absolutely crazy for the Madman stuff. If you want to learn more about the creation and evolution of Frank Einstein, aka Madman, please get in the comments section and let me know. Sound off. I would love to do a Madman episode. Anyway, originally Madman was published by the then still Kevin Eastman owned and operated Tundra Comics. Tundra folded really quickly though after only 3 issues of Madman, and most of its properties and licenses were going to be absorbed by Kitchen Sink at that point. It was assumed by both Kitchen Sink and Mike Allred at that point that Madman would naturally be part of this move. However, an old colleague of Mike Allred's, who had recently started working for Dark Horse Comics and was interested in becoming an editor, arranged a much more monetary beneficial deal, and Madman would find his more permanent resting place under the Legend imprint at Dark Horse, along with Hellboy and Sin City. It was during this time when Tundra was quickly disappearing into kitchen sink comics and Madman was finding his new home at Dark Horse that the phone finally started ringing for Mike Allred. At this point, he was starting to get work, and Allred has said in interviews that he was almost afraid to say no to offers. There was advertising work coming from every direction, and because he always met deadlines, Allred was starting to come into some demand and spread himself really thin, doing multiple synchronous projects. But he always answered the phone and he always went to meetings. Who knew what his big break was going to be? When a familiar face from his time on the fiasco that would have been Jaguar Stories from Comicology, Shelley Bond, showed up with a proposition for Mike Allred, it took some convincing to get him to show up to that meeting, though. Actually, it took a lot of convincing. Apparently, during the interim between her time at Comico and the phone call to Allred, Shelley Bond had become Karen Berger's most trusted assistant and right-hand woman, and she had called up the then still extremely salty Mike Allred with the intention of arranging a meeting between Karen Berger and Mike Allred. I'm not sure if Bond knew about Berger turning Allred down for Sandman, or if either of them knew how angry he was about it, but it's obvious that Berger had Bond make the phone call as a sort of diplomat to diffuse any kind of situation that there might have been, even before it got started, as well as to win over Allred by showing him that some of his old friend and colleagues worked for Berger themselves. Mike Allred had spent almost 3 years in a frenzy of action trying to prove Karen Berger wrong, showing her that he actually was indeed ready. Every success he had enjoyed over the past few years was a triumph against her unfair assessment of his talents. Karen Berger had been wrong, and this was going to be Allred's chance to show her just how wrong she had been. When they did speak, though, she quickly won him over. He was floored to learn she had indeed obviously been following his work quite closely, pointing out all the things that Allred had been working so hard to refine and perfect, and noting how much he'd improved in such little time. She had been watching and waiting for his talents to mature, and when they did, the right title to offer him. She felt like the Brother Power the Geek one-shot was that title, and that Mike Allred had earned his shot. It was time for him to start playing with the big boys. Allred came to the realization that Karen Berger wasn't an evil supervillain from a comic book who didn't let him do an issue of Sandman because she didn't like him, and the world wasn't somehow out to get him after all. Karen Berger was just a professional, and she didn't think he was ready for the job. And in retrospect, Mike Allred agreed with her. After this initial meeting and some back and forth, Allred accepted the Geek one-shot assignment, and a brand new chapter in Mike Allred's career was set to begin. Invitations to contribute pinups and advertising work began to pile up so quickly that Mike Allred really wasn't taking on many new assignments. The man who had spent years tirelessly looking for work was now tirelessly working to complete the seemingly never-ending workload he was confronted with. During work on the Brother Power the Geek one-shot, Mike Allred finally got that phone call he'd been waiting on, though. 3 years before, that is. Neil Gaiman was on the phone again, but this time Gaiman didn't have to consult Berger or have Allred complete any sample pages. Neil Gaiman was calling to offer him the gig, which had sent Mike Allred into a 3-year blind rage of self-improvement, catapulting his skill set and storytelling abilities into hyperdrive in the process, an issue of Sandman. It was 3 years later, and things had changed for Gaiman by then. He was now in a position to offer a job to basically whoever he wanted, and he wanted Mike Allred to do Sandman. But Mike Allred wasn't in the same position either. His time was valuable, and he had real concerns about the story pitch that Gaiman was giving him for the proposed Sandman issue. The story Gaiman wanted Allred to work on dealt with an old Joe Simon creation, Prez, the Teenage President. But Brother Power the Geek is another of Joe Simon's ultra bizarre and over-the-top wannabe hepcat hippie creations. And Allred was really unsure about tackling another goofy Joe Simon creation. I think he was expecting something a little bit more serious from Gaiman, to be honest. While known for his all-ages approach to storytelling and his art, which often utilizes humor to varying degrees, Mike Allred does not do funny books. There's an underlying meaning and utilitarian reason for the way his characters act that has to do with his often ingenious storytelling, but people don't always get that, and Mike Allred was afraid Neil Gaiman was missing the point of his art and his storytelling abilities. After some back and forth with Gaiman, though, who promised that he was really going to make the issue something special, Allred finally inked the agreement to work on the now legendary Golden Boy story for Sandman issue number 54, released in October of 1993. And the rest, as they say, is history. I used to wonder about all the crazy early 90s stories that we missed out on by Mike Allred getting turned down on that issue of Sandman. I was really hung up on what we could have missed and what was possible, but listening to Mike Allred talk about it all these years later, it was that precise moment in his life, Karen Berger's harsh, if honest, critique of his work, which proved to be exactly what Mike Allred needed to turn him into the one-man cartooning machine that he is today. Allred singles out and credits it all the time with evolving his style from amateurish at best to a level of passable professionalism in a matter of months rather than years, in his words. Within the span of 3 short years, Mike Allred had gone from a man devastated enough after his agonizing defeat at the hands of Karen Berger he had considered leaving the comic industry, to a one-man powerhouse who was so busy with advertising and art assignments from the likes of Marvel and DC, as well as writing, drawing, and putting out his own creator-owned property, that he actually considered not taking the very assignment which he spent almost 3 years fuming over being denied. I think Golden Boy was worth the wait, and I hope you all thought this video was worth it too. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. As always, links to all of my digitally available sources are in the description link below. Remember, if you liked this video, please do me a favor and hit that like button. If you really enjoyed this video, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell to keep up with these doses of trivia and all the other content I'm releasing these days. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, have any questions about anything in this video, or you have a suggestion for a video that you'd like to see, please think about getting in the comment section below. Not only does it really help me out when you all leave comments, but I've done some, and I'm working on some absolutely fantastic videos from your guys' suggestions. So thanks again for your suggestions. Thanks again for sticking with me. And as always, I hope you enjoyed, and I really, truly, and honestly ask only 2 things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.